Hello, I'm Therese Oldenburg, retired executive director at Nature at the Confluence. Nature at the Confluence is an environmental learning center that opened in 2017, right here at the confluence of Turtle Creek and the Rock River. So thank you for joining us today, and we're going to now slip into presentation mode so you can learn more about Chloe Blodgett. For thousands of years, this land has been occupied by Native Americans. In fact, in 1832, K-Chunk Village was recorded as the largest Ho-Chunk village in Wisconsin and Illinois, in the Northwest Territory here. After the Ho-Chunk were removed from the land by treaty, white settlers moved in and began to change the land, plowing under the prairie, changing the course of the creek, and forever changing the landscape at the confluence. And unfortunately, over the last 100 years, the land was degraded and became a wasteland. Nature at the Confluence now is working to bring the land back to the beauty that the Ho-Chunk loved and appreciated and the first white settlers embraced. We know that so many women have lived here at the confluence of the Rock River and Turtle Creek, but we know so little of their lives. So much in written history is about men and their accomplishments, and little is written about the women who lived here raising their families. Caleb Blodgett's considered Beloit's founding father, but in this program, I'm focusing on his wife, Chloe, Beloit's founding woman. There's a song that comes at the end of the wildly popular Broadway play Hamilton, which is about Alexander Hamilton's life. At the close of the play, the lead characters sing the final words. Who lives? Who dies? Who tells your story? Will they tell your story? Well, I'm here today to tell Chloe's story. Again, while today we're talking about the first settlers here at the confluence of the Rock River and Turtle Creek, we are referring to the white people that came here to settle the newly opened government land that was acquired by treaties with Native Americans. But I want to be sure we acknowledge Ho-Chunk people, the Ho-Chunks that made their home for hundreds of years before white settlers came. They lived here at K-Chunk Village along Turtle Creek before being forced to leave after an 1832 treaty. I can only imagine what the remaining Native Americans were thinking as they watched Caleb Blodgett arrive and start building his new community on their beloved homeland. But now I'd like to take you back to 1875 to Massachusetts, where the first protests, riots, and the first battles of the Revolutionary War occurred. The area was home to many notable Revolution-era icons such as Paul Revere, John Adams, Samuel Adams, and John Hancock. Each town had a group of trained Minutemen who were ready to respond in a minute's notice at any time, at any hour. They carried their equipment wherever they went, even if they went to church. They were prepared always. And Chloe's 26-year-old father, John Kidder, was one of the Minutemen of Sutton, Massachusetts. And you can see his name down there on the list from Colonel Ebenezer Learned's regiment. On April 18, 1775, Paul Revere began his midnight ride to Concord to warn that the British appeared ready to make trouble. On April 19th, the Minutemen from Sutton marched off to Concord to help protect Massachusetts from the British forces, and John Kidder was among them. His regiment was involved with 6 additional battles, including the Battle of Bunker Hill. When John walked to Concord with his regiment, he was leaving behind his wife Sarah and 2 sons, ages 1 and 2. He later returned to Sarah, and they had 5 more children during the time span of the American Revolution. Their 7th child, Chloe, was born just 1 month after the Treaty of Paris officially ended the war on September 3rd, 1783. So Chloe's family was certainly swept up in the American Revolution and its aftermath. Her childhood and upbringing during this turbulent time certainly would have had an impact on the woman that she was to become. At age 8, in 1792, Chloe's family moved to Randolph, Vermont, likely in search of new land to settle. Randolph was a newly established town due to open government land, and one of the founding families' name there was Blodgett. Caleb Blodgett's father ran an oil mill and a tannery. He kept hotel and ran a line of stagecoaches. Caleb's uncle owned a sawmill and a grist mill. And although 3 years older than Caleb, Chloe likely attended school with Caleb and worshiped at the same church, likely the first congregational church there. On Christmas Day, 1807, at age 24, she married Caleb Blodgett in Ashtabula, Ohio, a small settlement near Lake Erie. It's interesting to note that at one time, Christmas Day was one of the most popular days to get married, as the working class had a day off. So Chloe had her first child there, and over the next 22 years, she gave birth to 10 children. The last one was born in 1831 when she was 43 years old. Caleb, however, was a restless person seeking new opportunities. So around 1810, they moved to the new communities of Alexander and Batavia, New York, where she and Caleb and her brothers, Salvi Kidder, Caleb's parents, and her parents moved to help establish these new communities. But it wasn't long, and Caleb, ever the entrepreneur, looked to stake his claim back in Ohio. So in 1810, he packed up Chloe and their 3 children and headed to Kellogg'sville, Ohio, and bought a distillery and purchased 50 acres of land. Moving to a new place so far from home and with young children must have been a challenge for Chloe, but she would have had to put her fears aside, follow her husband, and be ready for whatever was to come. She had married an inexhaustible entrepreneur who had the pioneering spirit. And thankfully, Caleb was content to make his mark here for 20 years while Chloe gave birth to 7 more children, adding to the 3 boys they already had. It's unknown how much Chloe would have had been involved in his business dealings in their years here in Ohio, but she surely would have been a big part of it. To say that he was what we now today call a serial entrepreneur is an understatement. I worked for a serial entrepreneur, and it's quite exhausting. It never ends. So let's take a quick look at some of Caleb's business dealings. In Kellogg'sville, Ohio, he built a 15-mile turnpike plank road made of logs that were covered with dirt. And during times of heavy rain, the dirt would wash out, and the effect would be much like riding on a 15-mile washboard. Blodgett's Turnpike, which it was what it soon became named after, Caleb Blodgett, was mockingly became known as the corduroy road, like the fabric, corduroy fabric, bumpy fabric. So despite the bumpy ride, a toll was extracted for those who dared to travel it. And my research into turnpike toll roads shows that most of these entrepreneurs and enterprises didn't turn a profit for the stock owners of the road, but they were often built to spur economic development and trade. So Caleb took a risk building his turnpike, but it paid off handsomely for Kellogg'sville. In those early days, salt was essential to life in the wilderness. It was used to cure and preserve food and made it possible to transport food over large distances. So for people of Kellogg'sville, the nearest supply was from a salt extraction and drying operation from Salt Springs in Syracuse, New York. And here it's showing the drying process of the salt and extracting the moisture and drying out the salt. The finished product was shipped by boat to Ohio. Then it was loaded on smaller vessels and then paddled up the creek as far as what's called the Salt Road. It's about less than a 3-mile road. And there, that salt traveled to Kellogg'sville via Blodgett's Turnpike, and then would have been transported further on from there. And so there's just an example of barrels that would have contained salted pork. And that was a preservation method that was used to preserve all kinds of foods and for millennia. So this is not a pioneer thing. This was happening all over the world. One of Blodgett Turnpike's toll gates was in Kellogg'sville, so there were two, and you would have paid getting on or getting off. But there in Kellogg'sville, Blodgett took up tavern keeping. Taverns were a necessity in an era when roads were poor and transportation methods were slow. They provided shelter from the hardships of travel and weather, as well as refreshment, a forum for exchange of news and information, and a floor or bed on which to sleep. And it was common for the tavern owner to wear many hats, including distiller and postmaster and running stagecoach stops. So Caleb was just the man for the job. The town's first tavern was a frame house Caleb built in 1811, and it served the community till 1824 when he built the Old Brick Tavern, with the first floor providing food and refreshment, and the second floor was a dance hall and a meeting place. It is said that lodging in this bustling community was so scarce that travelers slept on bedrolls spread out on the barroom floor, although there's some speculation it had more to do with the abundance of Blodgett's whiskey that he made. With business booming, Caleb built a second tavern in 1825 across the turnpike, just across the road from this, with 22 rooms. Caleb bought into enterprises operating stage lines between Buffalo and Cleveland and from Erie to Pittsburgh. In addition to transporting passengers, these stagecoaches also delivered mail along the way. Caleb built a large brewery and distillery to transform wagon loads of grain into beer and whiskey, which was transported north to the harbor on Lake Erie and from there to buyers in Canada and New York. To build his distillery, Caleb had leveraged his other properties and interests, and this was to later prove to be a bad financial decision. He also built a flour mill in Sheffield, Ohio, near Cleveland, and a steam grist mill in Kellogg'sville, continuing the long Blodgett family tradition of milling. But Caleb was not content to corner the hospitality and transportation market. He built the community's first tannery. And from 1820 to 1825, he had the government contract to supply pork and beef to the garrison, the fort at Fort Howard in Green Bay, Wisconsin. And this also fit in well with the tannery operation that he built. And in this operation also added to the importance of salt for preservation to ship those meats all the way up to Green Bay. It was said that Caleb was a man who assumed great risks and at times would be unable to meet his financial obligations. One account says that he once bought a boiler for his distilling process in Pittsburgh. And while transporting it back to Ohio, he hid inside it to evade men whom he owed money at his stage stations. Another time, he was kidnapped by men who wanted to take him back to Batavia, New York, where a bail bond awaited him. Not sure what that would have been about, the bail bond, but somebody wanted him back in New York, and they had kidnapped him, had him in a wagon, riding out of town. But he was able to yell and roast up some of his men who rode horses in pursuit, saving him. Caleb sounds like an exhausting man to live with. If you remember, Caleb had evidently borrowed on or leveraged his other properties and interests to build his distillery. And sadly, he went bankrupt after it caught fire and burned to the ground. A lifetime of toil, risks, growth, speculation, and establishing a new community, and it all went up in flames. So perhaps seeking to change his fortune after the bankruptcy, or perhaps to escape from creditors. Around 1832, Caleb and Chloe packed up their family and their belongings in a wagon and headed off to new opportunities that were opening up in the Northwest Territory, right here. They were beginning all over again. And here we are showing their movement towards Chicago, then on to Meacham's Grove. They headed west to Fort Dearborn, which was soon to become the incorporated town of Chicago. Caleb was discouraged to find swampy land. That was the only thing available to buy. All the buildable land had already been bought up by speculators. So they moved onward 25 or 30 miles and selected open government land for a farm at a newly established place known as Meacham's Grove. And Meacham's Grove is what's today Wheaton, Illinois. So let's take a minute to do a history check-in to see what was happening in the area where Chloe and Caleb were moving to. Let's take a minute to do a history check-in to see what was happening in the area where Chloe and Caleb were moving to. Just 60 minutes from Chicago and Meacham's Grove, the Indian Creek Massacre occurred on May 21st, 1832, in LaSalle County in Illinois. This was following a dispute about a settler who had constructed a dam that prevented fish from reaching a Potawatomi village. 15 settlers, including women and children, were killed, scalped, and horribly mutilated. During that attack, 2 young women were kidnapped, but were later ransomed and released unharmed about 2 weeks later. And that was due to negotiating efforts of a Ho-Chunk chief named White Crow, who was very popular. And he was a popular chief at K-Chunk, or what was called K-Chunk or Turtle. That's the name for Turtle. And that village was located right here. Then the tragic Black Hawk War put this wilderness region in the world spotlight. Like when this was going on, the whole world knew about it. This was big news. Meacham's Grove was only 60 miles from the Battle of Stillman's Run, which launched what is called the Black Hawk War. Now, this war only lasted till August 2nd. And if you look at the blue line, it'll show the route that Black Hawk took him. And he did not actually come into Turtle Village. That might have been very purposeful. We believe the Ho-Chunk actually led him away from the village because they had their crops here and they wanted to protect their land. The militia did come through Turtle Village and no one was there. The village was empty. This was actually, at that time, Abraham Lincoln was with the militia. So they slept a little bit north of the confluence area that night and moved on. In the meantime, at Meacham's Grove, Caleb built a log house and with the help of his sons, broke up a large number of acres and planted a crop. And this was to be their home for about 2 years. Accounts mention that their 2 daughters remained back in Ohio and they were attending school. And I have to wonder if perhaps Chloe was fearful of bringing them to this wilderness. But it was also written that she and Caleb valued education for girls and she wanted her daughters to be educated. The boys were supposed to work and help Caleb, but the daughters were evidently being educated back in Ohio. But when the Black Hawk War veterans, after the skirmish in August, came moving through on their way back to their homes in southern Illinois and Indiana, they described this place called the Turtle, and which would be K-Chunk Village, and the Rock, this river, where land was cheap, and they claimed that the first man to settle there would be the man to establish a new town. Caleb saw this as an opportunity for honor and profit. But I can only imagine the conversation between Chloe and Caleb about this next move. Was she tired of moving and starting all over again? After the Black Hawk War, fur trader Joseph Tebow, who lived in a cabin near the confluence of Turtle Creek and the Rock River, He saw that his business was not doing well because the tribal members were being forced off the land. And he was looking to move north to a more lucrative trading area on Lake Koshkonong. So in May 1836, Caleb Blodgett came, and he was seeking land with a gentleman named John Hackett. And Thibault struck a deal with Caleb, selling about 7,000 acres of land for about $200. But the amount of land, we don't have any recorded information about it. It could have been anywhere from 7,000. Some people said 20,000 acres for $200 or maybe even $500. But in general, there's some conflicted amounts in written history. But the land was his to develop then at that time. And then Thibault and his family moved north to, not long afterwards, to Lake Koshkonong. And at that time, there were still about 300 Native Americans living in the area, but they, again, were soon to be forced to leave the area. So Caleb went back to Meacham's Grove, but soon returned in June with his sons, Nelson and Daniel, and 2 oxen and a wagon, and they plowed a furrow on 100 acres, which would have considered a way to establish your claim by improving the land. And this shows the site of the Thibault's cabin. So this is an old map, and the site of the cabin is actually about where today's subway is on Sherland Avenue. The sign is right there, as you see, and a welcome sign as you enter Beloit on right on the corner of Sherland Avenue and State Street. And you can see in the map in the lower left on the state line there, the cabin is on this map, on this survey map that was done. And yeah, so that's the historic location of the Thibault cabin. But that fall then, Thibault was, he came back and he began to build a 2-room log house on the Rock River with the assistance of the Native American Indian men and women who helped him. It says roll up the logs, and that's written in the history book. Roll up the logs, and that might mean rolling up. So they were stacked logs. It was a log cabin. Might have been rolling them up into place. Not really sure what roll up the logs means, but in any case, that's what it was written. And this cabin was located about where Bagels and More is today, or Bushel and Peck. The parking lot in the back overlooking the river is about where it was located. There was a huge fireplace with a hearth that faced into both rooms. And that first year, it did not have a floor. So maybe straw or animal skins or mats would have served as a floor until spring, when Caleb built the first sawmill powered by the Turtle Creek water. And then he cut planks for a floor. Horace White Jr. wrote that he lived in that cabin later with his parents, and he remembered it was not unusual in the wintertime for snow to sift through the cracks, and they'd wake up with snow on their bedding in the morning. Evidently, the rafters were open, and the ceiling up there provided a place to store. He remembers his mother would store dried pumpkin strips and would make pies out of it and use it for cooking and herbs and things like that. So not any space was wasted in the cabin. So the cabin's, one of the rooms was for the family, and that was for sleeping and cooking. And up to 10 members of the Blodgett family used that room, including Chloe and Caleb, their 4 sons, their daughter Cordelia, and her husband John Hackett. And the older sons didn't come till later. The other room served as an office and a dining room, a sleeping room for land hunters that were coming, mill hands, people here helping, land breakers, and travelers. So it was a busy place. Well, so he was building this in the fall, and he finished it just in time to fetch Chloe and several of their children from Meacham's Grove and settle them in before Christmas. Now, the word fetch here sounds like a simple task, right? But I want to include a description someone wrote about slogging their way to Blodgett's place from Meacham's Grove in the springtime to give you a perspective of what it was like for these settlers. And they said, it took 5 days of hard toiling through mud and sloughs and forging across rivers and creeks. If the water was high, you'd have to carry items over singly in a dugout canoe, so a barrel in a dugout canoe. And this process would consume several hours of time at each place of crossing. So this was no easy journey, especially in the winter cold. It also meant 4 nights sleeping out in the cold, and then Chloe would be doing her best to make meals over the fire. But when they arrived here at Blodgett's place, I think about what their first Christmas was like in this rustic cabin in the frontier. It must have been a vastly different Christmas than the ones that they'd experienced in the previous comfortable home in Ohio. Chloe must have been a patient woman who believed in her restless husband and dutifully followed him wherever he went. It was a tough life in the prairie, carving out a living from the land, which they now called Blodgett's place. Chloe fed large groups of people in her crowded cabin. It was said her bill of fare consisted of salt pork, bread, and coffee served with milk. So her bill of fare would mean this is what she was serving. It was usually 2 big meals a day, and it was salt pork, and bread and milk. And it sounds like that's what she served for every meal. One night, their cabin was crowded with about 20 land seekers who'd been eating everything in the Blodgett pantry before going to bed. And in the morning, Chloe found nothing in the pantry to serve the hungry men for breakfast. So Caleb went out into the yard where the oxen were resting from a day of plowing, and he dispatched old Bright and soon had a supply of meat for Chloe to cook up for the hungry men. In the fall of 1832, their 22-year-old son, Selby, had gone missing while on a business trip to New York. Now, remember, they were living at that time still in Ohio. But because he had $2,000 with him, which would be equivalent to about $70,000 today, it was speculated he'd been robbed and murdered. Several months later, Caleb posted a notice in large city newspapers seeking information about Selby. And I'm just going to read a little bit about this. Son of Caleb Blodgett, who left his father's home on the 12th of September for New York. It's been ascertained that he arrived in Buffalo on the 14th of September, and he stayed at someone's name, not a friend, but a person's name, Mr. Kelsey, who keeps a house of entertainment, and he stayed with him. On the 16th, he left his bags with Kelsey and went to visit friends in Alexander, New York, and returned to Buffalo the next day. He made a sale of a small quantity of pork and received the money. And Mr. Kelsey says afterwards, he came to the house and took away his bags, and further, there could be no trace since then. And so he also had 15 tons of butter in his care, which was received in Buffalo on September 18th, and then shipped to New York. Wow, that's a lot of butter. He was a professor of religion. He had good habits. This is a description that Caleb's giving of his son. It's believed that he might have been murdered while at Buffalo, and strong suspicions are entertained against Mr. Kelsey. But he's pleading, if anybody knows anything, if he is in the land of the living or if he is dead, that it should be known how he came to his end. And he's asking that every editor in the United States give this notice a place in their papers and serve the cause of justice and humanity. Selby was 22 years old, about 5'2", light complexion, blue eyes, round features, and inclined to smiling while talking. Any information relative to him, whether dead or alive, will be thankfully received by his afflicted father. So that's a pretty sad story. But it was 5 years later, while living here, that Caleb announced, I'm going to go buy some hogs and I'm going to find my son Selby. When he returned with 200 hogs, he said he'd found Selby. And he was married and living with his own son in Ohio. There's nothing further written about why Selby went missing, but I'd like to know more of that story. where did you go, Selby? And why didn't you let your mother and father know that you were okay? But I'd also really like to know how Caleb drove 200 hogs to his new home along the Rock River. We don't know where he picked the hogs up from, but I can't imagine hogs just go where you want them to go. So I can imagine that is quite the chore just to move 200 hogs along on a trail, a narrow trail. But I can only imagine what it was like for Chloe and Caleb to wonder if their son was alive or dead for 5 years. And what a great joy it was to find out he was not only very alive, but he had a wife and a daughter, or a child. I'm sorry, it was a son. Selby and his family soon moved here. And as a side note, Selby's home is one of the oldest still standing here in Beloit, built in 1847, overlooking the Rock River at 417 Bluff Street. It is listed on the Historic Register and has been in the loving care of the Carson family to this day for over 56 years. Women during the frontier times were the backbone of the family, and they played a huge role when it came to survival on the frontier. It was these ordinary women that helped build villages and towns and whose very faith kept their family going. From all accounts, faith was something that Chloe had in great abundance and likely clung to when times were rough. Churches were built on the Wisconsin frontier almost as soon as settlers arrived. From wherever they came, they brought with them strong religious beliefs. And when times got tough, they needed to rely on those beliefs. Robert Crane was one of the first settlers here, and he says that it was at his urging that the Sabbath be observed, while Blodgett family records say it was due to Chloe. Either way, it appears that both were of like mind. According to the Crane family, and this is Robert's account, it was Sunday, March 12th, 1837, and all the men had left to hunt, take walks, or just enjoy some free time from work. So they had a free day off. And most people in bigger cities and towns established would be keeping the Sabbath and reading and reflecting and worshiping together and totally having a day of rest. But on this particular day, the men had gone off doing different things. His account says that Mrs. Blodgett was a very good Christian woman, and I enjoyed passing time with the family. It seems that he and Chloe were looking out of the cabin window to watch her son Daniel and another man, Otis Bicknell, attempting to canoe up the river, but giving up after fighting the strong spring current. Robert Crane says, I remarked to Mrs. Blodgett that we ought to commence in our new home to show a proper regard for the Sabbath. Yes, she replied, wish you would speak to Mr. Blodgett about it. I immediately started on my errand. Found him in the boarder's room, packing the pork, which Daniel had brought home in bulk the evening before. And while he was pounding it down in the barrel with an axe, I said to him, it seems to me highly important that we commence our new settlement right in regards to keeping the Sabbath, that we ought to discourage all loose habits. And if we observe the day properly, it would have a tendency to attract good citizens of good moral standing among us. And on the contrary, if we paid no attention to this day, treating it as a holiday or no better than other days of the week, we would repel the better class from us. Then I referred to the boys in the canoe outside and others out hunting and closed my argument by saying the character of our future neighbors would depend very much on the habits and doings of those who settled here first. Although giving attention to what was said, Mr. Blodgett continued packing his pork, but evidently appreciated the force of my remarks, and he replied, yes, we must keep the Sabbath. It will not do to disregard it. We want the right kind of people to come here, and I must try to induce them to come and stay with us. It was at this juncture that Otis and Daniel came in from their river adventures, and turning to them, Caleb said, boys, this will not do. We must keep the Sabbath. But at the meantime, Caleb continued packing his pork, but also giving him a good lecture on Sabbath breaking. Daniel just walked away. But Otis remained enjoying the moral point made on their conduct by the senior member of the family, who, while delivering his lecture, was creating a still greater breach in the moral code of not keeping the Sabbath. But after finishing packing the pork, Mr. Blodgett did retire to the family room, where he remained for the rest of the day. And so the following Sunday, March 19th, Crane and Chloe's desires to keep the Sabbath came true. It was apparently cold outside, so instead all people gathered in the Blodgett kitchen. Caleb took his large family Bible and began to read from the place where he chanced to open it, the book of Job in the Old Testament. And it's important to note that the first Congregational Church was organized on December 30th, 1838 in the Blodgett kitchen. And later, I believe maybe because different people were living in this home after Caleb built a different home, the Methodist Church and a school were later organized in that same kitchen. And this is a older photograph of the Blodgett family Bible, and this is the family record, and it has listed in there when Caleb was born, when Chloe was born, when they were married, and then all the family members and when they were born. So it's very cool. It's still in the care of the Blodgett family, as I understand. Now, pioneers' lives were not always comfortable or easy, but their lives would improve, if not today or tomorrow, perhaps next year or in 5 years or in 10 years. They just needed to have faith and to keep believing and continue to work hard. Chloe would have taken care of a garden to feed her family in the summer and for throughout the winter. It would have been her job to ensure her family had enough food for the year ahead. The men would help clear the land for the gardens, and the children would help with maybe the weeding and hoeing. But summer was a busy time of year for Chloe, who spent most of their daylight hours harvesting their gardens and putting up food and storage for the long, cold winter ahead. Here on the edge of the wilderness, Chloe's chores were numerous and included running the overall household, cooking, cleaning, raising children, helping with chores, including feeding chickens, collecting eggs, milking cows, churning butter, doing laundry, sewing, mending. It all took up so much amount of her time. Many women on the frontier had to be the doctors of the house for their own families and their own pharmacists as well, because they would have to make recipes for homemade medicines to cure common illnesses. Another Wisconsin pioneer woman, Ann Porter, had a journal, and she recorded some of her commonly used remedies in her journals. She had a recipe for diphtheria, rheumatism, and her cure for the common cold included using cayenne pepper in tea. Chloe gave birth to 10 healthy, thriving children who lived through adulthood. But illness was a great concern on the frontier. Some of the most common illnesses were cholera, malaria, measles, mumps, whooping cough, and fever. And tuberculosis was a big health concern during this time period. And in Wisconsin at that time, it was one of the leading causes of death among adults. The number of cases in women especially were much higher than men, and they died more often than men did. And that may be because they were indoors more and they weren't outside in the fresh air as much as the men were, or it may just probably was because they were the caretakers. They were the ones taking care of the ill. With Caleb's vision in place, the new community, now called Blodgett's Place, quickly grew, as you can see from this 1837 Kelsey's plat map, showing how in just a few years it went from a one-room log cabin to a prosperous community growing on the edge of the prairie. So on the top left, you can see Blodgett's first home. That was a two-room log cabin. And then Blodgett's final home, and he built a new home after he had on the mill race, and you see the mill race down below. He made from Turtle Creek. He diverted water to power a mill, and that was their final home. And Chloe lived in this new home less than 1 year before she died. So while a Pioneer Beloit book that I used quite heavily as a reference, in that book it says there are no authenticated pictures or paintings or daguerreotypes of Caleb or Chloe. But this image was obtained from the Beloit Historical Society, and it was evidently from family. And it indicates that it is Chloe with her two sisters, and they were both here at some time when she was alive here. So they came to visit and stayed. And actually, Mary Kidder Clark, she ended up staying and is buried in Oakwood Cemetery. Her other sister did not stay. But the question mark here is, the daguerreotype was really, I mean, it was invented in 1938 and it really did not get here for a couple of years. So since Chloe died in 1838, this really can't be a live photo of her, but it could, someone could have painted them, and perhaps this is a photo of the painting so that everybody could, you know, maybe then everybody in the family could have a copy. So that's just my guess. It's up to you, you decide, but not quite sure. It's a mystery. But I share with you this quote by Caleb and Chloe's son-in-law, John Hackett. And this is about Caleb. And there's a lot written about Caleb, actually, and recorded about his personality. But this one just talks like about his strength of personality and character. He had a keen intelligence, industry that was literally indefatigable, and a resistless energy that carried everything and everybody before him or with him. So he sounds like a really, really powerful personality. And that's who Chloe was married to. There's not a lot is written about Caleb, and especially Chloe, much after this time. And then, as I said, unfortunately, she didn't have long to enjoy her life at Blodgett's place on the edge of the wilderness on the Rock River, as she died in 1838 at the age of 55. And Caleb died just 2 years later in 1840, and he was 54 years old, and they left young children behind. But she and Caleb left a legacy to inspire their family and the people in the new frontier town that they founded. Chloe and Caleb were originally buried in what is now called Horace White Park, but they were later moved to Oakwood Cemetery when it was established. And that's where they are today, and the gravestones are there. Chloe and Caleb gravestones, weathered as they are now, are the only thing left to bear witness to their birth and their death. There's no hint to these remarkable people that lie buried there. Caleb, who was an entrepreneurial visionary, brave and daring, and sometimes foolhardy, and his faithful, patient, enduring wife, Chloe, who stood by him for better, for worse, through all their life adventures. And the plaque on this screen, too, also shows that they are daughters, son and daughter of the American Revolution, so revolutionary soldiers, and was placed there by the Beloit chapter of the Daughters of American Revolution in 1931. And there was a ceremony, and family and friends gathered to place that there, and that is right in front of their grave. I just want to note, too, at Heritage Days, if you enjoy this history, on Heritage Days, there is a guided tour, and we stop at different gravestones. I gave the Chloe and Caleb story this year. Different people will tell you about all the amazing people that made Beloit is what it is today. So that will be coming up, and there's all kinds of interesting things that happen throughout that whole weekend all over the city of Beloit. So put that on your calendar and learn more about digging into the history of Beloit. So I just want to talk a little bit about the Blodgett legacy. So while no building exists in Beloit that Caleb and Chloe lived in or built, if you travel to Ohio, you can still see the old brick, it's called, built in 1824. This nearly 200-year-old structure has walls that are 4 bricks thick, so it was made to last. It has been added onto, and you can see on the right-hand side the addition, and it is now 4,200 square feet in size. In Blodgett's time, the second story was that dance floor area, and it was heated by several fireplaces. You can see the chimneys for those. And then downstairs is where the travelers would eat and drink, socialize, catch 40 winks on that bedroll spread across the barroom floor. And there were stables to the rear that provided lodging for the animals. It is interesting to note that in the mid-1800s, long after Caleb and Chloe moved away, Ashtabula County there was an instrumental part of the Underground Railroad system, assisting slaves in gaining their freedom. The old brick was a known stop on the Underground Railroad. Many people who settled this area had kept their sentiments of their New England ancestors and were fierce abolitionists. So an unknown amount of escaped slaves found freedom in Canada thanks to the many conductors in Ashtabula County. And the 15-mile road that we talked about, Blodgett's Turnpike, that was used as part of the Underground Railroad route. The Stanhope-Kellogg'sville Road, as it's called today, where the old brick is located, was one of the most early highways in the early history of Ashtabula County. And Kellogg'sville was an important, thriving hamlet. It got a significant boost from the construction of Blodgett's Turnpike Road. And thanks to this turnpike, the community grew into a bustling town whose population was at one time larger than that of Cleveland. Now, the two lines, there's an orange line and then there's like a burgundy line, and you can see it better on the left-hand side, and on the map it's overlaid. And that is, the burgundy line is Blodgett's Turnpike. The orange line is what's called the Salt Road, and that was the shorter road that connected, that's where they got out of the creek. And it came from Lake Erie, there was a creek, and they took the salt and everything else that came from into the area down by creek, and then they got on the Salt Road and then on to Kellogg'sville using Blodgett's Turnpike. And it was such a bustling community that there were 13 harness makers. And that's because this business was fueled by the Teamsters who used that road to haul from all the way up in Lake Erie, all the way down to the Ohio River. And the transportation trade also justified 3 wagon building shops, a dozen blacksmith shops, several distilleries, a tannery, the grist mill and sawmills, and again, there's 2 stage lines. So, very bustling and busy. But unfortunately, Kellogg'sville experienced a quick decline after 1870 when railroads began replacing these old turnpikes as the preferred way to move goods and people. And then, unfortunately, the hotels and many other businesses went bust. Caleb Blodgett's efforts to put Kellogg'sville, though, on the map were appreciated by people still living there today. And they named a road near Old Brick it's now called Caleb Road. And you can see that road today. It's on the map. It's the little dot on the right-hand side. It's called Caleb Road. And that was renamed in 1990. So they still think about him and appreciate the efforts he made to put Kellogg'sville on the map. Ashtabula County is in Ohio's northeast corner, and it's considered the covered bridge capital of the state, and is home to 19 of these unique structures. While these were not made during Blodgett's time, they're still standing, and some have been rebuilt, but 3 of them are located on roads that intersect the old Blodgett Turnpike. So his turnpike did not cross water, it ran along a creek. And then to get across the creek and to move goods and whatnot over the creek, then they later built these covered bridges. So, but if you're planning a fall trip out east, enjoy the fall colors, stop by and see Blodgett's original road and these 19 covered bridges at the Covered Bridge Festival in October. Sounds like an awesome thing to do. Caleb's family was very involved in the Revolutionary War, and his father was a friend of George Washington and served as a captain, and he's pictured in the photo near the top. Caleb's uncle, reclining in a chair there, is Samuel Blodgett Jr., and he served on George Washington's staff during the Revolutionary War. He was important in building the foundation of Washington, D.C. as the national capital. And he served as a chairman of the board of the commissioners tasked with designing the capital city. And he also used some of his own wealth to finance the construction of both the U.S. Capitol and the White House. And he raised funds for these as well. But however, one of his schemes to raise funds for these buildings caused him to become bankrupt and unfortunately led to prison time. As I said, in 1847, their son Selby built a home high on the bluff overlooking the Rock River. Selby and his son were in the grain milling business and established the Blodgett Milling Company. After fire in 1898, they moved it to Janesville. And the Blodgett Milling Company Incorporated was a feed mill that lasted until 1854. And it eventually burned down too. It is now actually in a new form, I believe, located in Fort Atkinson. It's a garden store and offers pet and animal feed. So it's still there today, which is very cool. The Blodgett family lives on doing great things. In fact, their great-great-great-grandson, Frank Caleb Blodgett, was a long-time member of Beloit College's Board of Trustees and was a prominent leader in food operations. He started out in his family's milling business in Janesville, Wisconsin, and later joined General Mills, where he worked his way through the ranks. In 1992, he retired as co-chairman of the board. He has unfortunately passed, but in his younger days at General Mills, he observed 6 by 300-foot sheets of granola cereal rolling out of the oven at one of the company plants, and he said, let's cut that into bars, thus spawning a wildly popular product in 1974, Nature Valley granola bars. And his success proves that the Blodgett creative and entrepreneurial spirit lives on. I thank you for joining me today to learn more about the Blodgett family and Beloit's early history. I hope you enjoyed Chloe's story and the story of Beloit's founding woman. And if you're able to donate, that allows us to keep bringing free programs like this to the public. And I thank the Beloit Historical Society for providing access to their files. And I am very grateful to those who have carefully researched and documented Beloit's history, especially Arthur Lupe, who wrote Pioneer Beloit, fabulous book about the history of Beloit. It wrote in 1976 after painstaking research that he did, and it's still available. You can buy it at the Beloit Historical Society. So thank you for joining me.